I have presided over a great many things in my life. I have presided over tenant disputes and contested harvests, over the wills of men who died, owing more than they owned, over hunting rights and timber rights, and the interminable question of which fence belongs to whom. I have sat in the county magistrate's chair in Merstone Hall for 11 years, and in that time I have heard arguments that ranged from the genuinely complex to the genuinely absurd. I have been bored. I have been irritated. I have on 2 memorable occasions fallen briefly asleep. I had never, in 11 years, been astonished. Until the morning of the 14th of October, when they told me a Miss Cora Dunmore had arrived to represent the interests of the Holt estate, I did not recognize the name. That is the first thing I must confess, and I confess it with a shame that has not left me in all the years since. My secretary read it from his list, and I simply nodded and turned to the next page of the brief. A woman representing a tenant farmer's estate was unusual, but not unknown. A widow acting for a deceased husband, perhaps, or a daughter too poor to retain a solicitor. I assumed the case would be straightforward. I assumed she would present a letter, I would ask 2 questions, and we would be finished before noon. I was wrong about every single thing. She came through the door of the hearing room the way a person enters a room they built with their own hands. Not hurrying, not hesitating, walking to the respondent's table as if she had been there 100 times and expected to be there 100 more. She wore gray, not the gray of mourning, not the gray of poverty, a clear, composed gray that said, "I am not here to be looked at." I placed her at perhaps 25, though her eyes were older than that. She carried a leather satchel worn soft at the corners and set it on the table without a sound. Mr. Aldridge, the Duke of Fenwick's solicitor, a man of 50 years legal practice and approximately 50 years accumulated self-satisfaction, looked up from his own papers and then looked back down again. He did not acknowledge her. I watched him not acknowledge her and felt, without quite knowing why, the first faint prickling of attention. "Miss Dunmore," I said to open the record. "You are here representing the estate of Mr. Thomas Holt, deceased late tenant of the South Pasture at Fenwick Grange?" "I am, Your Grace." Her voice was clear and even. Not the voice of a woman bracing herself, just a voice. "And you are, forgive me, acting in what capacity? In the absence of a named solicitor?" She opened the satchel. "In the capacity of the person most familiar with the estate's records over the past 40 years, Your Grace. My father served as steward to the Holt family for 31 of those years. I have managed the Holt accounts myself for the past 9. Aldridge cleared his throat. "Your Grace, I must observe that the opposing party has presented no formal credentials. A woman's familiarity with domestic accounts is hardly the question before this hearing," she said without raising her voice, "is not my credentials, Mr. Aldridge. It is whether the South Pasture reverts to the Fenwick estate upon Mr. Holt's death, or whether the 42-year lease signed by the 3rd Duke of Fenwick in 1801 grants the right of inheritance to Mr. Holt's designated heir. I believe we can establish that without reference to my domestic arrangements." Aldridge blinked. I set down my pen. She had cited the correct year, the correct duke, the correct document. I did not yet know whether she was right, but she had named the instrument with the precision of a man who had spent a month reviewing the brief. And she had done it from memory, in the first 60 seconds, before she had opened a single page of that worn satchel. I looked at her more carefully. She was not looking at me. She was laying documents across the table with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who had organized this argument so many times in her own mind that the physical ordering of papers was the least interesting part of it. "Continue, Miss Dunmore," I said. She did. I will not pretend I followed every word of what came next with perfect ease. The lease of 1801 was not a document I had reviewed closely. That had been left to my clerk, who had summarized it in 3 lines. She had not summarized it. She had memorized it, cross-referenced it against the rent rolls of 1803, 1811, and 1829, and identified 3 separate instances in which the Fenwick estate had accepted payment from Thomas Holt's father under terms that, she argued, constituted tacit renewal of the inheritance clause. I knew enough law to follow her argument. I knew enough law to recognize that it was good. Aldridge knew enough law to recognize it was better than good, which was why he began to interrupt with increasing frequency and decreasing elegance, until at one point he challenged the authenticity of a payment receipt she had produced, and she simply turned it over and showed him the Fenwick estate's own wax seal on the reverse. The room was very quiet after that. I had been watching her hands while she worked, steady, precise, turning pages without fumbling, pointing to lines without searching for them. I had been watching her face, composed, a little intent, not performing composure, simply possessing it. I thought of a dozen things in rapid succession, none of them relevant to the hearing, all of them relevant to the question of how I had managed to sit in this chair for 11 years without ever encountering a mind like this one before. And then I remembered. It surfaced slowly, the way things surface that you have successfully buried. 3 years prior, a woman turned away from my secretary's anteroom. I had been told she wished to present evidence in a matter of tenant succession, and my secretary had told her the hearing date had passed and the record was closed. I had never seen her. I had never been asked. My secretary had managed the interaction entirely, and I had managed my ignorance of it entirely, and the succession had been settled in the estate's favor, and I had never thought of it again. I thought of it now. She must have known I had recognized something. She did not look at me when I went still. She was addressing the room's record, not my conscience, and perhaps that was the more damning thing. In conclusion, she said, gathering the last page of her argument into a precise stack, the lease of 1801 does not expire upon the death of the tenant. It transfers, by the explicit language of paragraph 7, to the tenant's designated heir. Mr. Holt's designated heir is his daughter, Miss Agnes Holt, who is 19 years of age and has worked the south pasture alongside her father since she was old enough to carry a pail. The estate's claim to reversion is without legal foundation, and I would ask the court to affirm Miss Holt's right of tenure. She sat down. The room was still quiet. Aldridge was looking at the wax-sealed receipt with the expression of a man who has walked into a room and discovered it, substantially smaller than he remembered. I ruled in Miss Dunmore's favor before the afternoon was out. There was no other ruling to make. She had been correct on every point, and the Fenwick Estate's solicitor knew it as well as I did. The record was clear. The lease was valid. Agnes Holt would keep the south pasture, but the record was not what occupied my mind as I gathered my papers and sent the clerk for my coat. I found her in the corridor. She was repacking the satchel, not with any particular haste, the way a person packs who has nowhere pressing to be and no patience for the appearance of hurry. Miss Dunmore. She looked up. Who taught you? I asked. It was not what I had planned to say. I had planned something more judicial, something about the quality of the argument, something fitting for the corridor of a magistrate's hearing room. What came out was the only thing I actually wanted to know. She considered me for a moment, the same composure, the same older-than-her years eyes. My father had an excellent library, she said, and a great deal of patience with a daughter who asked questions. Your father was a steward. He was. He was also the finest reader I have ever known. She buckled the satchel. He believed the law was meant to be understood by the people it governed. He was somewhat unusual in that view. I had no response to give her that was adequate to that sentence. I stood in the corridor of my own hearing room and felt for the second time that day entirely unprepared. 3 years ago, I said, the succession hearing for the Yarrow tenancy. You came to my offices. She did not look away. I did. My secretary turned you away. He did. The ruling went against the tenant. It did. There was nothing in her voice that accused me, nothing that required me to defend myself. She simply confirmed each thing I said, and the confirmation was worse than any accusation, because it left me no one to argue with but myself. I owe you an apology, I said. You owe Mrs. Yarrow an apology, she said. She is living with her sister in Ludlow and will be for the rest of her life. You owe me nothing, Your Grace. She picked up her satchel and turned to go. Miss Dunmore. She stopped. I was aware in some distant part of my mind of the clerk standing at the far end of the corridor, of the general incongruity of the Duke of Merstone, standing in a passageway with his coat still unbuttoned, trying to find the correct words for something he had no established vocabulary for. Would you consider, I said, appearing before this court again? She turned just slightly, one careful look. In what capacity, she asked. In whatever capacity you see fit. As a legal advisor. As I don't know what the correct term is. I don't believe one exists for what you are. I stopped, started again. The South Pasture is not the only case in this county that has been decided without full information. There are 17 open disputes on my current docket, and I suspect 4 of them have the same problem this one had. The wrong person doing the presenting. I would like the right person. She was quiet for a long time. Outside, a cart went by on the cobblestones. The clerk found something to look at in the middle distance. "I would need to see the case files," she said finally. "You can have them this afternoon, and if I disagree with a prior ruling, including yours, then I expect you to say so. In writing." "In writing," I agreed. She looked at me for one more moment. Something shifted, faintly, in those composed and careful eyes. Not warmth, exactly. Not yet, but the first motion of a door that has been closed for a very long time. "The files, then," she said. "This afternoon." She walked away down the corridor, and I stood there with my coat still unbuttoned, and the absolute certainty that I had just made the best ruling of my 11-year tenure, and it had nothing whatsoever to do with the South Pasture. I should say, for the sake of honesty, that it took another 8 months. 8 months of case files and disagreements and the particular pleasure of losing an argument to someone who is simply right. 8 months of letters that began as formal correspondence and became something else entirely. Something I looked for on my desk before I looked for anything else. Something I found myself rereading in the evening when the house was quiet. 8 months of learning that a woman who had built her entire mind out of her own determination has a quality of steadiness that no amount of education can manufacture. I proposed in the hearing room. I have been asked why, and the answer is that it was the only room where she had always been entirely herself. And I wanted her to know I was asking for exactly that woman, not some softer version of her that might emerge in a drawing room. She asked me to put it in writing. I did. 3 pages. She has kept them. Agnes Holt still works the South Pasture. She sends us a wheel of hard cheese every Christmas, wrapped in cloth, with a card that says very little and means a great deal. The Yarrow matter. I addressed it, quietly, through channels, with enough discomfort to constitute something approaching justice. If not all the way to it. My wife said it was the right thing to do, and that she expected no less. She then returned to the brief she was reading. I watched her read it, in the lamplight, in the chair she had claimed as her own in the first week and never relinquished. I thought, this is what it looks like. A mind working. A woman entirely at home in her own intelligence, in the room where she belongs, with no one in it who will ever tell her to be smaller. I have presided over a great many things. Nothing, before or since, has come close.